Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm Jonathan.
And today we thought it would be interesting diving into some history, but specifically I want to start with Jonathan. If you would tell us who all of these people are so the audience can know.
Yeah, well, these are the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And
Who is this guy?
That guy right there is an overweight man.
That's accurate. Who is this guy?
An older guy. Isn't that Wilson? Why don't you tell me who these guys are? What are you talking about?
I believe that is Wilson. He looks a little chunkier in that picture than I'm used to seeing him, but that is James Wilson. That's Francis Hopkinson.
Camera adds 10 pounds.
Yeah, when they were painting it, as they were sitting there and all the cameras were pointed at them, it just really made them look bigger.
Exactly.
Anyway, the reason we have these guys here is there was an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal, and the idea from the article is that some schools are teaching the 1619 Project, some schools are teaching more 1776 oriented curriculum, and there's a dichotomy between those two. That one shows America being birthed on racism and slavery, and one shows America as this epitome of freedom and hope and equality. And the article said, instead of having this dichotomy of two different curriculums, you really ought to combine them and teach both, because both have components that students need to learn. And it's a very different way to view the Founding Fathers, to view the identity of America, which is part of why we want to go through some of this. Because what schools should do is certainly, they should tell the whole story of who America is and what America's done, especially when it comes to their history class, right? Like if you're in math, you don't need to cover the 1619 Project or 1776. You need to teach numbers. What we've seen recently—
Well, numbers are racist.
Well, we've seen schools determine that, in math class, we need to teach about gender ideology and all these things which have nothing to do with addition and subtraction, although it could on some level, but not the way it's supposed to. With it being said, what we would identify is certainly schools need to get back to teaching the truth of America. The problem with one of the claims of the article, or one of the positions taken in the article, is that by giving both of these credence, then we're going to discover truth. Except if some of the claims being made are not rooted in truth, then spending more time, for example, with the 1619 Project does not help you discover the truth of America if they're not making truthful claims about America.
Exactly. So just to say, we should teach the 1619 Project and then also the 1776 Project, well, that's only true insofar. If we're talking about like the years, like, hey, let's teach what actually happened in the year 1619. Absolutely. I mean, we do that. It's what we've always said we need to do. Let's get back to the primary sources, see what actually happened. But to take the 1619 Project and say, we need to teach this in order to be fair. Well, if you're teaching them what's all wrong about it, then yeah, that'd be fine. But the thing is, you can't just say, let's make that curriculum as long as we're also making, the 1776 Project curriculum, because that's just bad history.
Right.
It is filled with inaccuracies, it is not truthful, and it's going to create a distorted image of the American past. Let's go back. Let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. Let's talk about the actual history of racism and slavery in America. Why that, occurred here. Where did it occur elsewhere? How did it get abolished in America versus the rest of the world? Let's get into those questions and find the answers. But just to say, let's teach the 1619 Project as curriculum is not good, because it's just filled with lies.
And to say it would be okay if you're comparing it and saying, well, they say this and they say this and they're both kind of true.
And the truth is somewhere, whatever.
Right, and this is where it's worth going back. So the very first article that was done by the primary editor of the 1619 Project was actually claiming the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers fought the Revolution to protect and preserve the institution of slavery. which is not even close to accurate. There's another article that actually makes the claim that in 1619 it was the first time that African slaves arrived in America, which is also crazy historically to think about, because before there were English or British colonies in America, there were Spanish colonies. There were even French colonies in North America, and specifically in the area we know as the United States of America, there were Spanish colonies. And if you think about the history of the slave trade, you had Muslim slave traders, and there were Spanish, and there were Dutch, and there were Portuguese slave traders. Well, the Spanish had colonies all the way back in the 1520s, the area that we know today as South Carolina. There were Spanish colonies, or a Spanish colony there, and they actually had African slaves in that initial colony. And in St. Augustine, Florida, there was actually importation of African slaves on Spanish slave trading ships coming in there. And it shouldn't be a surprising thought if there are Spanish colonies and the Spanish were part of the slave traders, they would have slave trade vessels coming to their own colonies. So this shouldn't be a surprising thought. And yet what people say is, well, 1619, that's the first time African slaves arrived in America. That's not historically accurate at all. And what's also worth noting is even this idea that in 1619 these slaves arrived in Jamestown, that is a very different history as well as compared to like a St. Augustine, or where these other slaves went in the North Atlantic slave trade, whether they were going to South America or Central America. The conditions in South and Central America, or even St. Augustine, Florida, were very different than the conditions of Jamestown.
That's right. And when you look at, the beginning of Jamestown, and really the English colonization efforts in the New World, you immediately start seeing a radical divergence from, say, the Spanish or Portuguese tradition, right? Where they're coming over. Spain starts importing African slaves to the New World as early as, the first years of the 1500s. So by the time that Jamestown gets founded, there's well over 100 years of history of African slaves in the New World, and like you mentioned, specifically in land that would later become a part of the continental United States, right? South Carolina, Florida. But when the English start colonizing, at that time in, the English Isles, there actually weren't any laws for slavery. Slavery had kind of been worked out, not exactly made illegal, but it was not practiced anymore in England. And so when their colonists arrive in the New World, they don't have slavery. They don't have laws permitting slavery. So that means when in 1619 this shipload of black slaves, because they had been captured off of a Portuguese slave trading vessel, gets brought to Jamestown, they're actually integrated into society. As far as we can tell from the historical record, they're integrated as what's called indentured servants on the same level as the white indentured servants. And so basically that just meant that they had to work for a period of time, and then after which they were freed, they were given full legal standing, they were given land, and actually I think some clothes from the people who they were working for. And some of those original slaves who came over and were brought to Jamestown in 1619 appear to have become extremely wealthy landowners in their own right, and then even had indentured servants working for them as well, both black and white. And so you look at that story in Jamestown, which is radically different from what the 1619 project claims and kind of implies, and then you look at, say, what happened in Central and South America underneath Spanish jurisdiction, where you have an extremely high mortality rate. They're really not given any sort of legal rights until way later. And so you immediately see a different kind of history appearing in America, one that, while is far from perfect, is definitely based and has the seeds of liberty there. Now, obviously, as the colonies in British North America develop, they begin to be heavily influenced by the Spanish kind of culture and an idea. There's a lot of trade going on there. The British found a colony in the Bahamas, which again, and so they really start adopting a lot of these slave laws in the South and Central American colonies of the British. And so that kind of is where that happens. But that happens way later than 1619.
Yeah, it's actually the late 1600s when slavery begins to be adopted in the American colonies. And with that being said, this is where, this idea that in school, and again, from this article from the Wall Street Journal, that we should study both the 1619 project and the 1776 curriculum, and let's study both of them so students can learn the accurate story from both sides. Well, both sides aren't telling an accurate story. And what we would say is, what we need to do is go back and study what's actually true, what actually happened. And Jonathan, as you mentioned, that the truth of America is not the story of a perfect nation or people, far from it. But when judged in context, it is the story of a nation and people striving to be better, largely because of their understanding of the Bible, because they, as Christians, they're trying to be different and they're trying to live godly lives. And so they're actually promoting freedom and equality beyond any other nation around them at a faster pace, at a higher level and standard than anybody else. And as we start studying the history, and even the reason we have up this picture of the founding fathers is a lot of the narrative today is tarnishing these guys as being evil, white, slave owners, bigots, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a few documents that are worth noting because a lot of the history of America today is told from the perspective of America being bad or America being evil. And then sometimes there is the swing in the opposite direction that, no, all these guys were great and wonderful. The truth is that if we read our Bible, it is the reality of humanity that nobody is perfect, that everybody has sinful, fleshly, evil, wicked moments in their life. There's a reason Jesus came, because we all need a Savior, because nobody's perfect. And yet, acknowledging the reality of imperfections, when you look back, the story of these guys is very different. In fact, even some of the allies, some of the connections they had with some of the heroes of the American Revolution. Let's start with the heroes of the Revolution, first of all, because the heroes of the Revolution are oftentimes very different than what a lot of people think. If you look, for example, the average soldier of the American Revolution. Jonathan, I know you were doing research on this, and some of your findings were really shocking to me. Looking at the difference between the length of service for the average white soldier or the average black soldier in the Revolution, it's pretty telling.
Yeah, so on average, the white soldiers served for a much reduced period. So basically, they would be more seasonal soldiers, aside from the officers who generally served for the duration of the war, right? Guys like George Washington, he was there for all of it. But oftentimes for the white soldiers, they had farms, businesses, and so they would go in for shorter enlistments of 3, 6, sometimes 9 months, depending on whatever the state was offering at that time. And, sometimes they would re-up later in other seasons, but generally those enlistment services were quite a bit shorter. However, when you look at the African American soldiers who fought in the American Army during the Revolutionary War, oftentimes they would serve for the duration of the war. I mean, by the time you get to the end of the Revolution, it's not impossible to say that quite literally some of the most experienced, best trained, and most competent soldiers in the Revolutionary Army are some of these black soldiers who have joined in at the very beginning and continued to serve alongside Washington for the duration of the war, which is very interesting to know.
It is, and this is the modern reprint. We actually have one of the originals from William Nell, and it's called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, where he goes through and just highlights all of the black heroes, and not all of, but like a lot of, more than 100 black heroes, and he goes through the various states and shows from this state, here's a number of the black heroes. And when we say black heroes, these are documented black heroes, where many of them received commendations or awards, recognition for their bravery on the battlefield, for the things they had accomplished. And there are many founding fathers working very closely, many, as you mentioned, even many white officers and generals working very closely with these guys. And some people today might say, okay, but right, like, weren't they all slaves? And this is where, again, worth noting, looking at American history, certainly in some of the southern states, whether it be a Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, there were some southern states where there might have been a provision that if you fight for a year as a slave, if you fight for a year, then maybe you can achieve your freedom. However, if you look in the northern states, the vast majority of the northern states had already emancipated their slaves and begun that process to emancipate their slaves. And so the black soldiers fighting from the north, by and large, were free men fighting not as slaves looking for freedom, but were free men fighting to protect and defend that freedom. And this is where, if we look even further, this is a document, this is the original Constitution from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. The reason this is significant, this is a reprinting of the Constitution from 1787. This was first founded in 1774. And Benjamin Franklin is one of the very few founding fathers who signed not only the Declaration, but the U.S. Constitution. After he signs the Declaration, 11 years later is when the Constitution, they're again back in kind of the same room, Independence Hall, and they're going over the Constitution. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin is actually the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society to end slavery. And why we bring this up is when you look at the founding fathers, again, today we're told that by and large, they were pretty much all racist slave owners. it's true that the majority of them at some point in their life did own slaves. Now, not all of them, because you do have guys like John Adams or like Sam Adams who never owned slaves and fight against slavery pretty much their whole life. So there were some founding fathers who were always abolitionists, anti-slavery. But then there's people like Benjamin Franklin who actually did have slaves, and he then freed his slaves and worked to end slavery in all of the nation. And what the 1619 Project does not cover or does not include in part of their narrative is the fact that the vast majority of founding fathers who had slaves end up coming out and speaking against slavery, end up freeing their slaves, end up working for abolition societies, join the anti-slavery movement. And this is where, again, going back to this notion, Jonathan, that people say, well, we need to tell both sides of the story. Well, that's valid if both sides of the story are presenting honest and accurate information. But if one side's not being honest in the story they're telling, then it doesn't really make sense to give it as much credence or as much room at the table if you're being dishonest, although we could acknowledge, right, the 1619 Project is saying, hey, America had slavery. We totally should include the reality of America's shortcomings. In fact, even of the founding fathers, there were a couple founding fathers who were pro-slavery their whole life and actually had some pretty racist positions. That's true for some of them. However, it's not true for the vast majority of them. The vast majority of them went a very different direction. And so this notion that we need to give the same amount of time for the 1619 Project and the 1776 curriculum, that's really not a good perspective. It really ought to be, we need to spend more time diving into what is true and teaching students how to discover truth.
That's right, Tim. But obviously, if we're going to say, let's focus on the truth, we have to ask the question, well, what is truth? How do you find the truth? Where do you go? And like what we've always said, the best way to do that is to go back to the original sources, right? Kind of one of our unofficial mottos here is don't take our word for it. We want you guys to, hear what we say, go to the sources, check it out for yourself. And so you can do that in a number of different ways. Obviously on wallbuilders.com, we have links to a lot of the primary sources. Almost every single article that we write and post online has footnotes to the primary sources. Additionally, too, right? Obviously we had the American Story come out the other year in the back of the book. If you haven't read it, you need to, because it's very good. It kind of goes from, Columbus to roughly the ratification of the Constitution. And in the back of the book, we have all of the footnotes. And that's one of the great things you can do with those is go look at the footnotes.
And then there's over 1,000 footnotes. It's like 20% of the book is just the footnotes at the end. So as you pointed out, this is something we're saying, hey, don't take our word for it. We are seeing a nation in so much trouble right now because for literally decades, people have just taken somebody's word for what was true. We've trusted professors and teachers, we've trusted news outlets, we've trusted social media, we've trusted the internet, and it's led us to a very dangerous place because there were people who were being dishonest in what they're presenting, and some people didn't mean to be dishonest perhaps, maybe they just had bad information. We want to make sure that we are discovering and finding what is true. So Jonathan, you mentioned the WallBuilders website. Obviously we have some resources like the American Story, a lot of footnotes in there. If people want to dive in maybe to additional historic resources, what are things you'd recommend?
Well, if you're wanting to do research into any of the aspects of American history that you find interesting or you want to know more about, some really good resources to go to would be websites like archive.org, which is basically an online library where you can go and read the scans for yourself. So books, basically anything in the public domain. You could also go to the AmericanJourneyExperience.com, which is another museum we help run, where they're in the process of really getting up and digitizing a lot of this collection. You'll see a lot of our artifacts, kind of a part of that are on loan there. And so you can go and read a lot of the books in our collection for yourself there. You can also go to Google Books as well and see a lot of those things there too, because really what you want to do is be able to look at it for yourself. You can also get reprints of things. This is one we've actually done recently on a Catechism of the Constitution, kind of an elementary primer on the various aspects of the Constitution, and that's a good way of doing it too, right? You don't always have to use your computer. You can get a reprint and read it for yourself if you're more, like having something in your hand.
I do.
And so there's so many ways of doing that. We've never had a time like this where individual people have more tools to be able to accurately search after truth. There's just a lot more voices yelling at you today than maybe in the past, but you also have better and more powerful tools to cut through those voices too.
So as the argument would be, you need to hear both sides of the story. We agree, you need to hear both sides of the story, but we don't need to trust that both sides of the story are equally true. We want to say, here's what both are saying, what is actually true, and that's where you go back to original sources. It's what we encourage all along. Make sure that you are pursuing truth, and what you'll discover about America is there is good, there is bad, there is ugly. What is fundamentally true is not that America was a perfect nation or had perfect people, but what is fundamentally true is there was a perfect God who used imperfect people in this nation and did really great things. That's the truth you'll discover. Hope to see you next time on One Room Schoolhouse.